I'm happy to be here today and contribute a little bit to these discussions about the legacy of the Marshall Plan. So my paper focuses on the role of George Kennan in designing the Marshall Plan, and I can also say the role of Marshall Plan in the US strategy of containment. So 70 years ago, on the 5th of June 1947, US Secretary of State George Marshall outlined in his famous Harvard speech an ambitious European recovery program that would soon carry his name, the Marshall Plan. He then stated that the modern system of the division of labor upon which the exchange of products is based is in danger of breaking down. It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health to the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is not directed against any country, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Historians disagree on the causes of the Cold War and differ widely in their assessment of its origins. However, when it comes to the origins of America's decision to confront the Soviet Union after the Second World War, they invariably focus on the strategy of containment and its generally acknowledged author, George F. Kennan, the US career diplomat and respected authority on Russia that in the late 1940s architected a foreign policy strategy that was to dominate American government perceptions and actions for more than 40 years. Best known for his long telegram sent from Moscow on 22nd of February 1946 and its elaboration in the X article in Foreign Affairs of July 1947, Kennan also played a key role in drafting the Marshall Plan. The United States entered the post-war era in a uniquely strong position. The United States almost doubled its gross nation product during the conflict. By 1945, it accounted for around half of the world's manufacturing capacity, most of its food surpluses, and almost all of its financial reserves. The United States lead in a wide range of technologies essential to modern warfare as well as economic prosperity. Although the United States demobilized its armed forces, it was still a strong military power. Its navy controlled the sea and alone possessed atomic weapons. For all that, the US economy has been threatened with economic depression due to declining sales both at home and abroad. Consequently, American officials entered the post-war era thinking more expansively than ever before about their nation's security and economic requirements. American foreign policy, 2 years after the end of the war in Europe, had to address several serious domestic and foreign policy problems. Many of them were interconnected, covering both internal and external policies, including major economic issues. In Europe, poverty and social tensions were growing up, especially in defeated countries. 2 years after the end of the Second World War, much of Europe still lay in ruins. European countries, including states such as Great Britain or France, struggled to rebuild their devastated infrastructures, and the continuing hardships people faced contributed to the growing electoral strength of the communist parties, especially in France and Italy. The United States recognized that bolstering the economies of the European states would not only undercut communist influence, but would also provide markets for American goods. US officials assumed that the creation of strong economies in a stable Europe would underpin democracy, and this would help to avoid a return to the conditions of the 1930s, when the failure of democracy, especially in Germany, was perceived to have occurred because economic chaos had undermined the will to resist. In January 1947, the United Kingdom notified the United States that it was no longer able to financially support Greece and Turkey. The US administration decided to grant Greece and Turkey sufficient aid with so-called the Truman Doctrine. It paved the way for the Marshall Plan, and it is often described as the first manifestation of the new strategic concept of the United States towards the Soviet Union strategy of containment. In April 1947, the US Secretary of State George Marshall asked George Kennan to leave the National War College and gather a policy planning staff as a source of independent policy analysis and advice for the Secretary of State. The first policy planning staff analysis that was drafted on the 23rd of May 1947 contained many of ideas and even some of the language used by Secretary of State at Harvard University on the 5th of June. This document did not see communist activities as the root of the difficulties of Western Europe, but it recognized that the communists are exploiting the European crisis and that the further communist successes would create serious danger to American security. The analysis presumed that American effort in aid to Europe should be directed not to the combating of communism as such, but to the restoration of the economic health and vigor of European society. It should aim to combat not communism, but the economic maladjustment which makes European society vulnerable to exploitation by any and all totalitarian movements, and which Russian communism is now exploiting. The analysis also claimed that the economic program that the United States would support must be a joint one, agreed to by several European nations. Kennan and his team suggested that further communist successes would endanger American interests, a situation that should be frankly stated to the American people. A sensitive issue was whether to invite the Soviet Union and its satellites to participate in the plan. Kennan recommended extending an offer, but in such a way that they would either exclude themselves by unwillingness to accept the proposed condition or agree to abandon the exclusive orientation of their economies. The paper's conclusion was that the steps should be taken to clarify what the press has unfortunately come to identify as the Truman Doctrine, and to remove, in particular, two damaging impressions which are current in large section of public opinions. These were, first, that the United States was responding defensively to communism and would not be acting in the absence of that danger. And the second, that the Truman Doctrine was a blank check to give economic and military aid to any areas in the world where the communists show signs of being successful. Instead, the United States must act only in cases where the prospective results bear a satisfactory relationship to the expenditure of American resources and effort. Particularism, rather than universalism, was Kennan's favored approach to international relations, and he emphasized that the US policy must concentrate on Europe and that the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan must not be considered as a universal American commitment everywhere on the globe. As Kennan predicted, the Soviet refused Marshall's offer to participate in a plan that required the free exchange of economic information. Under Soviet control, the Eastern European nation also declined to participate. It was an argument for US officials to blame the Soviet Union for dividing Europe, while the Soviets charged Americans with the attempt to dominate Europe economically. However, the Soviet Union needed a Marshall Plan less than did some of the Western economies. The plan functioned by relaxing balance of payments constraints, something the Soviet Union did not have to face because it did not import American goods. But one of the biggest costs of renouncing the Marshall Plan for the Soviets was the isolation of its affiliated communist parties in Western Europe. With expertise provided by George Kennan, policy planning staff crafted the Marshall Plan concept, which George Marshall shared with the world in a speech on 5th of June 1947 at Harvard. Marshall was convinced that the key to restoration of political stability lay in the revitalization of national economies. Further, he saw political stability in Western Europe as the key to blunting the advances of communism in that region. The Marshall Plan is often described as a corollary of the Truman Doctrine, as both are directed against Soviet expansion. However, both differ in their tactical deployment. The Truman Doctrine focused mainly on military aid, whilst the Marshall Plan was a package of purely economic support. The Marshall Plan had restored Western European solvency and self-confidence and had laid the basis for a long-term political, economic and military association with the United States. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States had achieved its main goals in Europe: the reconstruction of Western Europe in an American-centered multilateral system, the alignment of Germany with the West, and the containment of Soviet power in Europe. The Truman administration achieved these aims through the use of economic and psychological instruments rather than military power. This view of containment that Kennan preferred emphasized the non-military instruments of American power, of which the Marshall Plan was a prime example. Kennan, who, as was previously demonstrated, played a key role in designing the Marshall Plan, later recalled that the psychological success at the outset of the Marshall Plan was so amazing that we felt that the psychological effect was 4/5 accomplished before the first supplies arrived. However, Kennan was disillusioned when the US containment strategy shifted to universalism and militarization in the early 1950s. He opposed to resist communism wherever it appeared and consequently became a strong critic of US foreign policy in the following years. He, for example, mainly criticized the US intervention in Vietnam. It is often argued that the Marshall Plan initiated the division of Europe. But in 1947, an ideological and geopolitical conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was already emerging. Kennan's goal was not a division of the world into Soviet and American sphere of influence, but rather the emergence over the long term of independent centers of power in Europe and Asia. For Kennan, the Marshall Plan was a decisive first step in establishing a political balance of power in Europe. It threw the communist forces in Western Europe on the defensive and gave new confidence to non-communists. And in this way, it was definitely a successful example of economic and psychological containment. Thank you for your attention.